Happy spring, everyone. It was a gorgeous day. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about the aquatic plant community in your lake, which includes a mixture of native, non-native, and invasive plants. And I should probably start out by defining those terms. So native is indigenous and belongs in your system. Non-native has been introduced, but may not cause demonstrable harm, whereas an invasive is a species that is introduced and causes harm to the environment, economy, and human health. And those are the species that our agency manages for. We also refer to the invasive plants as noxious weeds. Some motivations for this presentation are all the questions that we receive from you lakefront property owners about plants around your property that cause a perceived nuisance. And there's questions about plant identification and how to handle perceived nuisance or overgrowth in dock areas, in areas that entangle your prop, at the launches, swimming areas, what to do about floating fragments, rafting on the lake, or washing up on the shore. I won't be able to answer all of these questions, but I hope by talking about the difference between native, non-native, and invasive plants, I will give you a little bit more context to make good management decisions. One important point is the beneficial traits of native plants. There are many gorgeous native plants that carpet your lake bed, and they do wonderful things for fish and wildlife habitat, fish and wildlife food availability, biodiversity. Some of these native plants will improve water quality through pumping oxygen into the water column. They improve the clarity of the lake by stabilizing the sediment, but also by pulling sediment out of the water column. And they act as a nutrient sponge to help with different types of algal blooms, and by extension, also helping with water quality and clarity. This is a picture, it's a little bit subtle, but it is from O'Rourke Bay in the autumn time. And it's a really large kokanee spawning run through what I would call kind of a subterranean creek that runs towards Coburn. And every time I've seen the salmon running, they're taking advantage of that native plant habitat and population there. So a lake without plants is not a healthy lake. So it's important to start to understand the differences between the native beneficial and the harmful invaders. Now, some damage that we have probably all experienced from the invaders in Hayden Lake are habitat loss. That's where you might lose some of your beachfront to plants that have topped out and turn it more into what acts like a marsh or a wetland. You also lose habitat for fish and wildlife. These dense stands of plants aren't useful for a lot of our favorite recreational fisheries. You lose water flow, and by that you lose oxygen in the water column. You have these interactions that are genetic with the native plants that cause these super plants through hybridization. Many people have noticed some impact economically. We receive a fair number of calls from real estate agents about what to expect maintenance-wise and cost-wise for certain properties on Hayden Lake. These nuisance plants, in contrast to the helpful natives, they can disrupt your utility and irrigation operations by clogging intakes and increasing maintenance costs more broadly. And the photo on the left is kind of classic Hayden Lake when the milfoil goes wild. And it's really even hard to motor through there with your boat. That's our work boat with the prop entangled with a Eurasian, probably hybrid milfoil mixture. What's also important to think about when you're trying to strike this balance and have a healthy native plant population is that invasive species on the land and in the water, they take advantage of disturbance. They take advantage of natural and artificial disturbances. And one type of disturbance is a removal or loss of the native plants that opens up lake bed real estate for them to just take off and flourish. And from that point, they'll often monopolize that space. And again, the picture, sadly, on the left is from Hayden Lake. It was Mawkins Bay in 2018 when the lake bed was very much overtaken and the flowering spikes were breaking the surface. It was really hard to recreate. And another type of disturbance that will facilitate invaders are human activities like our lawn care practices and nutrient runoff. That nutrient runoff can be entirely human driven, but it can also be driven by weather events like snow melts, just bringing natural nutrients from the watershed. But one really great thing about a healthy native plant community is they can preempt the invader from taking hold. And there was a nice article in the Coeur d'Alene Press last fall. One of the ways that you can inadvertently kind of promote the invader is by blowing your leaves into the lake, giving that huge, pulse of nutrients and organic matter. So thinking about ways that you can cultivate healthy natives and not foster or cultivate the invader is really useful. Now I have a little quiz for you to kind of get a baseline about where you're at in terms of recognizing your plants, because when you start to recognize the plants, and I'm not going to give you a taxonomy lesson right now, I think you guys would kill me, but I just want you to give you some overall kind of patterns to look for, because we have a whole lot of great native plants and not that many invaders. So you just need to be able to distinguish between those. So yeah, here's your quiz. I encourage you to, actively participate. If you want to pop in the chat, and some people like to use, there's a way to annotate. If you're into that, you can circle and write things on top. But anyhow, we've got a plant on the left that has large segments between the leaf arrangements. It is often confused with milfoil. I'll tell you it is not milfoil. Then we have a plant in the middle, which a lot of people would call a lily pad. It has heart-shaped leaves and white or pink flowers. And then on the far right, there is a plant with a red stem and leaves around the whorls, but the segments aren't quite as long. We have some engagement here. Well, plant number A is native. It's called water buttercup, and it comes by a couple other names, crowfoot. Plant B is non-native. It's not on our invasive species list. This picture was taken in Windy Bay on the south part of the lake. There we go. So Marianne's writing. And plant C is Eurasian water milfoil, and it's hybrid. I only have 3 of these, but I just kind of want to give you some exposure. We've got a plant on the far left that has kind of furled, curly leaves with serrated margins and turions. A plant in the middle that someone may also call a lily pad, but these leaves are much larger and the flowers are only yellow. And then on the far right, there is a plant that's often mistaken as milfoil. It has leaves about a whorl. And if you look closely at the leaves, people say they look like mule deer antlers. So what we've got here is the invasive curly leaf pondweed, followed by the native spatterdock, and lastly, the native coontail. Okay. This is kind of, this slide is meant for a couple of different purposes. One, it's kind of hard to tell what you're looking at. And a lot of times when we get pictures from the general public, it's hard to tell what plant species they're concerned about. But I can walk you through this. The photo on the far left and far right were taken on March 31st in McLean's Bay, photo on the left and the right, those are both a nice consortium of native species. We've got a lot of big leaf pondweed on the left and a lot of Elodea or waterweed on the right. In the middle, that is curly leaf pondweed. That was prior or / during our treatment. So I want to give you some characteristics to think about when you're trying to decide if you have a native or an invader around your property. And these are the two players that are the biggest problem in Hayden. And they are curly leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil. To start out with curly leaf pondweed, some of the things that you would look for is that ruffled leaf that we say resembles a lasagna noodle. The color morphology can be different, but they're often olive green to reddish brown and a little bit translucent. The very edges of the leaves are serrated. And as Jeremy spoke about these turions, these pine cone-like reproductive structures, you'll find them not all year round, but usually at the end of the season. And they're hard, they're firm to the touch, and there is no other plant in our lake that has turions. So that is a really good diagnostic, however limited in time because they're not there all year round. And Eurasian water milfoil, some things to look for. There are a lot of lookalikes. I mentioned the coontail and the buttercup, but the best thing for you to do is, pull a sprig out of the water, and the milfoil leaves resemble a feather. There's often 4 leaves around a single whorl. And if you're kind of up for it, you would count the pairs that are kind of like hairs that are coming out. This picture with my thumb from Lake Pend Oreille, that has 17 leaflet pairs. That is the invader for sure. And the color of Eurasian water milfoil is a mixture of green, brown, and red. And at certain times of year, similar to the turions in the curly leaf, you have these flowering spikes that break the surface. And those irritate a whole lot of people on Hayden because they give the impression that the plant has completely taken over your waterway. So I don't expect you guys to be taxonomists. I just wanted to kind of open your eyes to the fact that there are certain characteristics that'll help you decide if you have a helpful native or one of the problem invaders. But if you're struggling, just send some pictures. And the pictures like I showed on the rake, maybe not that helpful. It's really great if you can show a landscape picture, like the first shot, then get a little bit closer, then go ahead and take it and put it in a tub of clear water so we can see it not clumped up. And in the case of the milfoil, I've taken a cross section so you could look at the feathers that comprise the leaves, and that's even easier for us to work with. Enough of that. A lot of people ask, how do I manage my plants? And you can still manage these natives, but just know that if you remove them completely from the lake bed, you're opening up real estate for some aggressive invaders. And there are 4 basic management categories. Again, I won't go into tons of detail unless people have questions, but just to show you the range of options that we as ISDA entertain before we do a treatment plan and the choices that you have managing the weeds around your property. So the first is a mechanical approach. That is kind of what it sounds like. You use something physical to pull, to suck them. You can do it wading or sometimes with divers. Then there's biological control, which doesn't really apply that well here in the case of our 2 problem species, but that is when you use the plant's natural enemies that specialize specifically in that plant, and those enemies are strong enough to suppress the population. We don't really have that case here with milfoil and curly leaf. There's a suite of chemical herbicides that either target one species or are more general, but you have to think about the consequences of a general herbicide. If you wipe out the lake bed and the natives are gone, what is succession going to have in store? Then there's some pretty cool cultural practices that you can employ. Well, a lot of you can't change the water level in the lake, but Fish and Game can, Avista, Army Corps, that can be helpful in some areas, totally irrelevant others. And then culturally, you can put fabric or benthic barriers down to limit growth in a certain area. For instance, maybe an access point or a swimming area. And I wanted to go through some of the mechanical. Those are fairly accessible for small scale populations, but you've got those approaches that are very coarse in that they're not selective about the plant, like this harvester that's just ripping up everything on the lake bed. You've got a rake. I've seen a lot of you Hayden folks with the lake rakes. The rake is a good example of a tool that might be good for nuisance natives, but not as great for invaders, because when you start to fragment these plants like milfoil and curly pondweed, they just spread like wildfire. So just think about that. That might not be the best tool for our problem plants in Hayden. Then getting to be more selective, you can use divers. And then if you want to be the very most selective, you're going to hand pull without a suction device, one plant at a time. And that's very time consuming. I have a lot of questions about biocontrol, especially in the Lake Pond Array system. There's some folks that are really excited about that concept. Like I said, unfortunately, the science hasn't demonstrated that it's effective for our problem plants, but I wanted you to see the kinds of animals or critters that people consider. Those are, a lot of small invertebrates, insects, snails, sometimes fishes. I don't know of any situations where birds have been employed, but they are grazers and they will consume plants. But again, they're not targeted enough to suppress our problem plants. You kind of want to be dialed into all of your options. And I wanted to throw these contexts out there just because this is a kind of a multi-agency endeavor when it comes to managing the plants. We have a contact in ISDA based in Post Falls that is great at fielding questions about label and license requirements. Wes Green with Idaho Department of Environmental Quality can field questions related to kind of permitting the Idaho pesticide discharge elimination system permits. And then the last contact I wanted to share was Amity at Idaho Department of Lands, who can help with the permitting process regarding benthic barriers. And people often ask, what does this entail? These are 10 by 10 foot barriers that prevent any growth. And IDL does require a $25 permit filing fee annually. And the idea is somewhat user-friendly, but there's a fair amount of maintenance involved with flipping and burping these to do this right. And there, I'm back to your beautiful lake. I hope I just piqued your interest and boosted your awareness and some of the subtle differences between these helpful natives and the not so helpful, rather harmful invaders.